Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping right into something absolutely fascinating. We are going to take a journey through the incredibly complex, fleshy structures that literally dictate our movements, our highest thoughts, and even our deepest fears. We're looking at the literal architecture of you. This is an exploration of the dense geography of the human brain, and we're going to map out exactly how this incredible organ is built, working our way from the outside in. Here is the roadmap for our outside-in spatial tour today. We'll kick things off on the surface with the cerebral cortex, then move into the four lobes. From there, we'll journey deep inside to the brainstem and cerebellum, explore the inner control centers, and finally wrap it all up with the systems that handle memory, emotion, and protection. All right, let's start our journey right on the surface. Part 1, the cerebral cortex. Okay, let's really dive into this. If you were to look at the brain from above, the very first thing you'd notice is this massive, deep valley running straight down the middle. That's the longitudinal fissure, and it divides the brain into two separate cerebral hemispheres. But if you look closely at the surface of those hemispheres, it's kind of wild. It's completely riddled with all these smaller folds. The fissures, or the valleys, are called sulci, and the ridges that puff out around them, we call those gyri. Fun fact for you, if you were to somehow unfold all those gyri and sulci and lay them flat, the cerebral cortex would be about the size of an extra-large pizza. This incredible folding is what creates the outermost layer of the brain. So that highly folded outer layer, the cerebral cortex, is essentially where the magic happens for our most complex tasks. It's packed with highly distinct areas, completely devoted to processing sensory information and controlling movement. But it also contains what neuroscientists call association areas. These are absolutely crucial regions where information from various other parts of the brain gets integrated together. And it's exactly this integration that shapes how we think, how we reason, and how we actually perform higher-level cognitive functions. To get a better grip on this massive folded surface, we break it down into part 2, the four lobes. Here's the lineup: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Now, while each of these lobes contains dozens of individual regions, we can map out some very specific, everyday functions that each one handles. Let's break them down. What's really fascinating here is how directly this connects to your everyday life. The frontal lobe contains the motor cortex, which is your hub for voluntary movement. The neurons right there literally cause your head and body to move. But just in front of that, you have the prefrontal cortex. You can think of this as the engine of your future. It's the area involved in higher-level functions. Decision-making, planning, impulse control. Basically, your ability to act in pursuit of long-term goals. It is literally the reason you can plan for tomorrow. Moving just behind the frontal lobe, and they're separated by a little valley called the central sulcus, we find the parietal lobe. This lobe is what grounds us in our physical space. It houses the primary somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for processing physical sensations coming from the body. So whenever you feel a touch, a sharp pain, a shift in temperature, or even when you just kind of implicitly know where your arm is positioned without looking, a sense we call proprioception, you totally have your parietal lobe to thank for that. Taking up the very back of the brain, we've got the occipital lobe, which is almost entirely dedicated to visual processing through the primary visual cortex. Then, shifting over to the sides of the brain, we hit the temporal lobes. These guys are massive multitaskers. They're involved in higher-order visual processing, learning, and memory. But crucially, the temporal lobe also houses the primary auditory cortex. So yes, this is what gives us the ability to perceive sound. Now, this brings us to one of the great ongoing mysteries of the cortex: human language. For most people, the left cerebral hemisphere is what handles language, but the workload is actually split into different zones. Up in the frontal lobe, we have Broca's area, which is thought to be vital for language production, like physically forming the words to speak. But then, right near the junction of the temporal and parietal lobes, we have Wernicke's area, which is linked to language comprehension. What's absolutely fascinating is that while we know for sure that damage to these areas messes with these abilities, their exact roles and the precise mechanisms of how they process language, that's still being fiercely debated and explored by neuroscientists today. So we've spent all this time looking at the lateral, outer view of the cerebral cortex, but what happens if we were to slice the brain right down the middle and look at the medial, inner view? What exactly lies beneath the surface? As we journey down to the back and bottom of the inner brain, we reach part 3, the brainstem and cerebellum. Extending from the very back and bottom of the brain is this highly folded structure called the cerebellum. Remember how the motor cortex in the frontal lobe initiates your movement? Well, the cerebellum is working tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure those movements are actually smooth and coordinated. It's essentially the brain's autopilot for physical tasks. It handles your balance, your posture, fine-tunes your movements, and even manages movement-related learning, like the muscle memory of riding a bike. Tucked just in front of the cerebellum is the brainstem. This is the absolutely crucial connector between your brain and your spinal cord, and it's divided into three main regions. At the bottom is the medulla, which literally keeps you alive day in and day out by regulating vital functions like cardiovascular and respiratory activity. Right above that is the pons, which carries information to the cerebellum, and it also contains clusters of neurons tied to the cranial nerves that control the sensory and motor functions of your head and face. Let's move up to the top part of the brainstem, the midbrain, to see how all this builds into some of our most complex behaviors. The midbrain houses the two largest dopamine-producing areas in the entire brain. First, the substantia nigra, which is vital for movement. In fact, this is the specific area where dopamine neurons unfortunately die off in Parkinson's disease. The second area is the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA produces dopamine and sends it shooting along a pathway straight to a region called the nucleus accumbens. This exact dopamine path is absolutely critical for how we process rewarding experiences. It's literally the physical root of addictive behaviors. And both the substantia nigra and the nucleus accumbens are part of this much larger network called the basal ganglia, which is basically the manager of our habit formation and reward processing. Moving up from the brainstem, we dive deeper into part 4, the inner control centers. Sitting perfectly right above the brainstem is the thalamus. You can think of the thalamus as the brain's grand sensory relay station. Almost all sensory information, with the one single exception of smell, travels from your sensory receptors and stops at the thalamus first. It's the gatekeeper. The thalamus then routes that data to the right area of the cortex for processing. Just behind the thalamus is this tiny, fascinating structure called the pineal gland. It's actually called that because it's shaped exactly like a tiny pine cone. Its main job is to react to darkness by secreting the hormone melatonin, acting as the ultimate timekeeper that regulates your circadian rhythms. So the big question here is how the brain actually translates these neural signals into bodily responses. Well, just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. It is the absolute master of homeostasis. It regulates your thirst, your hunger, body temperature, and even your stress responses. But how does it pull that off? It does it by sending signals to the pituitary gland, which hangs right beneath it. In response, the pituitary gland releases these powerful, life-altering hormones straight into your bloodstream. Things like growth hormone and thyroid-stimulating hormone. Oh, and it also secretes oxytocin and vasopressin. Actually, scratch that. Those two are technically made in the hypothalamus, but they're sent down to the pituitary to be released into the body. And that brings us to the final stage of our tour, Section 5, Memory, Emotion, and Protection. Tucked away deep inside the temporal lobe are two adjacent structures that just fundamentally shape our human experience. First up, the hippocampus. The word actually translates to seahorse in Greek entirely because of its curved shape. While it does a lot of things, it's most famous for its role in memory, specifically taking your fragile short-term memories and locking them in as permanent long-term ones. Sitting right next door is the amygdala, getting its name from the Greek word for almond. This is your emotional core. The amygdala permanently records how you react emotionally to the world. It's super well known for processing fear and responding to sudden threats, but it's also responsible for processing positive emotions like pleasure. Now, remember way back at the beginning of the explainer when we talked about the brain being split into two separate hemispheres? Well, for us to function, they obviously have to act as one unified architecture. This is pulled off by a massive C-shaped structure located right smack in the center of the brain called the corpus callosum. It is the largest bundle of axons in the entire brain, and it acts as a high-speed communication bridge, constantly firing information back and forth between the left and right hemispheres. I mean, every single time you use both hands to type on a keyboard, this bridge is rapidly firing millions of signals to keep your hands perfectly coordinated. Finally, how is all of this incredibly delicate architecture protected? Well, all throughout the brain, there's a system of hollow cavities known as ventricles. Specialized membranes inside these cavities produce something called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. This fluid completely surrounds the brain, acting as a gentle, incredibly effective protective layer. It literally suspends the brain in fluid, which drastically reduces the physical strain that gravity would otherwise have on all this heavy tissue. On top of that, the fluid is continuously flowing, basically washing away metabolic waste products and keeping the whole neural environment perfectly regulated and safe.
And that brings us to the end of our anatomical tour. As you reflect on the structures we've explored today, I really want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. We've been looking at pounds of flesh, folded ridges, chemical pathways, and internal cavities. But how exactly does this incredible architecture, suspended in a bath of fluid in the pitch dark of your skull, literally construct every single thought, feeling, and action that makes you who you are? It really is the greatest mystery in science, and the crazy part is it's happening right now, inside of your own head. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this sparks your curiosity to just keep exploring.